My name is Maya Chen. I'm 36 years old. When my stepmother Patricia stood in a lawyer's office and told me, my brother, and our assembled relatives that my father's will had been updated 18 months before his death, and that the lake house, the one place on earth my father loved with his whole heart, had been left entirely to her, I sat very still. I did not cry. I did not argue. Because 3 days before that meeting, I had been at my father's house for the last time before it was locked up. And in the bottom drawer of his desk, under a manila folder full of fishing lure catalogs, I had found an envelope. It was dated 4 months before the will Patricia had just presented. Before I tell you what was in that envelope, hit like, hit subscribe, and tell me in comment from where are you watching this story, and let's start at the beginning. Because my father deserved better than what happened to him, and so did the place he loved most. The lake house was not grand. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because when I describe what it meant to our family, I do not want you to imagine something impressive and then feel that the feeling is proportionate to the size of the thing. The feeling was enormous. The house was modest. It was a 2-bedroom cabin on the east shore of Carlisle Lake in Clinton County, Illinois, purchased by my father in 1993 for reasons that had more to do with a memory than a calculation. He had gone fishing at Carlisle as a boy with his own father, a grandfather I never met, a man who worked in a shoe factory in Centralia, and who had, as my father described it, an almost supernatural ability to know where the fish were. They had gone twice, in consecutive summers, before my grandfather got sick. My father had never forgotten those 2 summers. He talked about them the way some people talk about faith, as a fixed point, a reference, a thing you go back to when you need to remember what matters. He saved for the cabin for 11 years. He was a mechanical engineer for a manufacturing firm in St. Louis, disciplined, with money in the way of someone who grew up without enough of it. He drove the same car for 14 years. He packed his lunch every day. He did not take vacations that required airplanes. He bought the cabin in 1993, and for the first several years he drove out alone on weekends, which I know because my mother mentioned it with a fondness that surprised me, given that she and my father had divorced in 1990. She said, he was happy there. Whatever else, he was truly happy there. My name is Maya. My brother is Daniel. We are 3 years apart. I am older, and we grew up primarily with our mother in St. Louis, spending summers and alternating holidays with our father. The lake house became the center of our time with him. He took us in July. Every July, without exception, from 1994 until Daniel went to college and I went after him. 2 weeks on the east shore of Carlisle Lake. My father teaching us to fish with the same methodical patience he applied to everything. Early mornings on the dock with coffee, his and hot chocolate, hours watching the fog burn off the water. The particular smell of the cabin, lake water and pine and my father's coffee, and the cedar closet where he stored the fishing gear. Fireflies in the evenings. The sound of water against the dock pilings when a boat went by. Daniel caught his first bass when he was 9. My father took a photograph and framed it. That photograph was on the wall of the cabin from 1996 until the day I last walked through the door. I want you to understand the lake house not as property, not as square footage and assessed value and deed and title, but as 20 years of July, as the place where my father was most himself, as the only place I have ever been where time moved at the speed it should. My father's name was Robert Chen. He died in August 2021 at 68 years old. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in February, swift and merciless in the way of that disease. He had been married to Patricia Holt Chen for 3 years at the time of his death. They had met in 2017, married in 2018, after a courtship that Daniel and I were peripheral to, not excluded, not resentful, but present at a distance. The way adult children are when a widowed parent finds happiness, and you are glad for it and do not know how to participate. My mother had died in 2012. My father had been alone for 5 years before Patricia. I did not begrudge him Patricia. I want to say that clearly, I did not. I begrudged what she did with the lake house. But we will get to that. My father was a man who expressed love through specificity. He did not say "I love you" easily or often, that was not his language, but he remembered things. He remembered, years later, that I had once mentioned that I preferred a particular brand of hot sauce, and he bought it. He remembered, without being reminded, every significant thing that had ever happened to Daniel and to me. He showed up. When Daniel defended his dissertation in 2015, my father drove 4 hours from St. Louis. He sat in the front row. He had read the dissertation, all 287 pages, and had questions. That was Robert Chen. Specific, present, reliable, the kind of man you can build your understanding of the world on. He was also, in a way I understood only in retrospect, lonely after my mother died. Not demonstratively lonely, he was not that kind of man, but alone in a way that left a shape in rooms. He had his work. He had the lake house. He had Daniel and me, at whatever distance adult children maintain. But the particular companionship of a long marriage was gone, and I think he felt its absence without knowing entirely how to address it. When he met Patricia at a work conference in 2017, he called me a week later with the specific careful tone he used when he was not sure how something would land. He said, "I've met someone." I said, "Tell me." He told me, Patricia Holt, 55 at the time, a human resources director, twice divorced, 2 adult children of her own, a son, Kevin, and a daughter, Brenda, who lived in different cities and visited infrequently. He described her as warm and capable and easy to talk to. I met her the following spring. She was all of those things on first meeting. She had a professional warmth, attentive, asking questions that signaled she had remembered things from previous conversations, making space for you in the way of someone who understood that making space was a skill. I told Daniel, "She's good at it, being likable." Daniel said, "That's not necessarily a bad thing." I said, "No, but it's different from being likable naturally." He said, "That's a fine distinction." It was, and it was the right one. My father married Patricia in October 2018. Daniel and I attended. The ceremony was small, a county clerk's office, a dinner afterward at a restaurant my father chose because he knew I liked their sea bass. That was him. Even his wedding dinner was arranged with someone else's preference in mind. Patricia brought Kevin and Brenda. Kevin was in his early 30s, in software, with the distracted energy of someone who was tolerating the event. Brenda was 30, quieter, who watched everything and commented on nothing. The reception was pleasant. My father was happy. That was the right thing, and I held on to it. What changed in the 2 years that followed, what I understand now that I did not fully understand then, was the gradual adjustment of my father's relationship to his own life. Small things at first, his schedule, his routines, where he spent his time. He had always called me on Sunday evenings. This was a habit so established that it had the quality of furniture, solid, always there, not remarked upon. In the year after the marriage, the Sunday calls began arriving later, shorter, and occasionally not at all, replaced the next day with a text that said he had gotten busy. I did not flag this as alarming. He was married. His Sundays were no longer his alone. This was reasonable. But the lake house visits changed too. For his entire adult life, my father had gone to Carlisle Lake for his birthday weekend in June and for 2 weeks in August. These were fixed points. In the summer after the marriage, 2019, he went alone in June as always. But the August trip was cut to 1 week, and Patricia joined him, which was new, and Kevin came for 3 days of that week, which I had not expected. Daniel went up for a few days and called me afterward. He said, Kevin seemed very interested in the dock repair my dad had done. I said, "What do you mean?" He said he kept asking how much things cost. The dock, the roof, asking about the property taxes. I said, maybe he was just making conversation. Daniel said, maybe. We both said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Patricia called the cabin our family place. Twice. I said, did she? He said, yeah. I said, I'll come up in September. I did. I came up alone, without calling ahead, on a Saturday in September 2019, which I was entitled to do because my father had given me a key and a standing invitation. The cabin was unlocked. My father was on the dock. We fished for 3 hours. We talked about small things. At one point he asked me what I thought about the lake house, about what should happen to it eventually. I said, what do you mean? He said, I'm 66. I think about these things now. I said, I think it should stay in the family. He said, yes. Just that, yes, and then he recast the line. I have thought about that conversation many times since. I think he was trying to tell me something. I think he did not know how to say it directly, and I did not know to ask directly, and we both did what people do in families where directness is not the native language. We circled the thing and left it in the middle of the conversation. He died 2 years later, and I discovered what he had been circling. My father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in February 2021. He called me himself, with the same careful tone he had used when he told me about Patricia. I drove to St. Louis that weekend. By then, the house he and Patricia shared was thoroughly Patricia's in its arrangement, her furniture, her colors, her way of organizing a living room, and my father moved through it with the comfortable ease of a man who had adapted. This is not a criticism. He was happy. He looked tired because the diagnosis had already taken something from him, but underneath the tired he was the same. I want to be precise about what I observed in those early months of his illness, because precision matters. Patricia managed his care efficiently and thoroughly. She attended every medical appointment. She researched his oncologist, his treatment options, his medication schedule. She was at his side in ways I could not be, because I lived in Chicago and had a job and she was there. I am not going to pretend this was not real or that I was not grateful for it, because I was. What I also observed: Patricia's son, Kevin, began appearing at the St. Louis house with increasing frequency after the diagnosis. He had not been a regular presence before. Now he was there 2 or 3 weekends a month, sometimes staying for a week. He and Patricia had long conversations that stopped when I entered the room, not guiltily, not dramatically, but with the particular gear shift of people who have been discussing something they are not ready to share. My father was tired easily. He slept in the afternoons. The conversations Kevin and Patricia had while he slept were ones I was not part of. I tried to spend as much time in St. Louis as I could manage. I came every 3rd weekend. I called every other day. My father and I talked, really talked, the way you talk when time is clarified by its limits. He told me things about his life that I had not known. He told me about the 2 summers at Carlisle Lake with his father, in more detail than he had before. He told me that those 2 summers were the clearest memories he had of feeling loved in a specific and uncomplicated way. He said, I wanted to give that to you and Daniel. The lake house was for that. I said, I know you did. He said, I want to make sure it's right. I said, what do you mean? He changed the subject. He was tired. I let him change it. What I understand now, and what I could not see clearly then because I was watching my father die, and that takes all of your attention, was that something was happening in that house that I was not privy to. Documents being prepared, conversations being had, an attorney being involved whose name I did not learn until after my father was gone. In June 2021, 2 months before he died, my father had a clear week, the particular unexpected clarity that comes sometimes toward the end, a window of energy and coherence that everyone knows is temporary and that everyone pretends might not be. He called me on a Sunday evening, the first Sunday call in months that arrived on time. He said, I need you to come next weekend. I have something I want to do. I came. He was in his study when I arrived, the room that was still his, still arranged the way he had always arranged it, the only room in the house that had not been Patricia's territory. He was at his desk. He had a document in front of him. He said, "I've been working on getting things in order." I said, "Okay." He said, "The lake house, I've updated things. I want to make sure it's protected." He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been through a great deal and was running on what was left. He said, "There's an envelope in the bottom drawer, under the fishing catalogs. I want you to know it's there." I said, "Should I look at it now?" He said, "Not now, just know it's there." I said, "Okay." He nodded. He looked, for a moment, like the man on the dock at Carlisle Lake, like my father at his most himself. He died in August. I drove down for the last week and was there. Patricia managed the funeral arrangements with the same efficient competence she had managed everything else. Kevin and Brenda were there. Daniel was there. There were relatives I had not seen in years. It was the usual terrible shape of these events. The will reading was scheduled for 3 weeks after the funeral. 3 days before the reading, I went to the St. Louis house to collect some of my father's personal items that Patricia had set aside. While I was there, while Patricia was on a call in another room, I went to his study. I went to his desk. I opened the bottom drawer. The manila folder of fishing lure catalogs was still there. Under it, exactly as he had said, was an envelope. I put it in my bag. I did not open it in the house. I drove back to Chicago first. Then I opened it. It was a handwritten document, my father's handwriting, careful and clear, the engineering precision that characterized everything he wrote. It was dated April 12, 2021, 4 months before he died. It was titled, "Statement of Intention Regarding Property." It stated, in plain and direct language, that it was his wish and intention that the property at Carlisle Lake, the cabin, the dock, the 2 acres of shoreline should pass to his children, Maya Chen and Daniel Chen, in equal shares. It stated that this intention had been communicated to his estate attorney, one Margaret Voss, and should be reflected in the documents she had prepared. It stated, "If any document exists bearing my signature that contradicts this intention, I ask that my children investigate the circumstances of its creation with the assistance of a qualified attorney." My father had been a mechanical engineer for 40 years. He wrote the way he designed, every specification included, every contingency accounted for, nothing left to interpretation. He had known something was wrong. He had prepared a record. I called Daniel that night. Then I called an attorney. The will reading happened in the office of an attorney named Gerald Marsh, who Patricia had retained, or who someone had retained on her behalf, after my father's death. His office was in Clayton, Missouri, in one of those buildings that look like serious money and turn out to have very little natural light. Daniel and I drove down together from Chicago. We had talked in the car about what I had found. We had decided to say nothing, at least initially, at least until we understood what we were dealing with. There were 8 people in the room: Patricia, Kevin, Brenda, Daniel, and me, 2 of my father's cousins who lived in the area, and my father's sister, Aunt Helen, who was 72 and had known him since he was born and sat in the corner with a very straight spine and an expression that suggested she was not going to accept anything without understanding it fully. Gerald Marsh read the will. The version of the will he read had been executed, according to its dating, in October 2020, 10 months before my father's death, 4 months after my father had put his handwritten statement in the desk drawer. Wait! October 2020 was after April 2021. No, April 2021 would be after October 2020. Let me be precise about the timeline. My father's handwritten statement was dated April 12, 2021. The will Patricia presented was dated October 2020, so the will predated the handwritten statement by 6 months. Which meant my father had written his statement after the will was signed. Which meant he already knew what the will said, and he did not agree with it. The will, as read by Gerald Marsh, left the lake house in its entirety to Patricia for her lifetime, with no provision for it to pass to Daniel or me. The remainder of the estate, a modest amount, was divided in a way that was conventional and uncontested. Patricia sat with her hands folded. Kevin, beside her, had the particular careful stillness of someone who has been told in advance what is coming and is monitoring the room's reaction. Daniel's hand found my arm under the table. My Aunt Helen, from the corner, said, "Robert told me in July he was going to leave the lake house to the children." There was a silence. Gerald Marsh said, carefully, "The document before us represents Mr. Chen's expressed wishes at the time of its execution." Aunt Helen said, "And what were his wishes in July 2021? Gerald Marsh said, more carefully, "I was not involved in any subsequent documents." Patricia said, "I think we should let the document speak for itself." Aunt Helen said, "I think Robert should speak for himself." Patricia said, "Robert is gone, Helen." The room was very quiet. I said, "Thank you, Gerald. We'll be in touch." Daniel and I drove back to Chicago largely in silence. At one point he said, "She knew about the letter." I said, "Yes." He said, "Which means she knew what he really wanted." I said, "Yes." He said, "And she did it anyway." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "What do we do?" I said, "I've already called an attorney." The attorney I had called was a woman named Sandra Park, a probate litigator at a firm in Chicago with a reputation Greta would have recognized: thorough, precise, not easily impressed. I had called her the day after I opened the envelope. I had not told Daniel immediately because I wanted to understand what I was dealing with first. Sandra had already told me. The handwritten statement, while powerful as evidence of intent, was not a will and would not supersede a properly executed will. What we needed to do was challenge the October 2020 will itself, its circumstances, its execution, its relationship to my father's demonstrated intentions. She had also told me, "The name of the attorney Margaret Voss, which appears in your father's handwritten statement, is significant. If Margaret Voss prepared documents for your father that contradicted what this will says, we need to find her." I had already tried to find her. Margaret Voss was not in the phone book. She was not on any bar association website I could locate. The name, as far as I could tell from a full evening of searching, belonged to no licensed attorney in Missouri. Either my father had misremembered her name, or the name was false, or she did not exist. The implication of each of those possibilities occupied me for several days. Then Daniel called. He said, "I found something." He had gone to the St. Louis house with Patricia's permission to collect more of our father's belongings. While there, he had gone to the study. Patricia had already had the study cleaned out. This was new information because I had been there only 3 weeks earlier and it had been intact. The desk was empty. The fishing lure catalogs were gone. But Daniel, who had spent his career as an academic and who had a habit of looking in the corners of things, had pulled the desk drawer out all the way and found, taped to the back of the drawer interior, a business card. The name on the card was not Margaret Voss. It was a woman named Carol Deering, a notary and document preparation service on South Grand in St. Louis. My father had been to a notary. Whatever he had done, he had had it witnessed. I called Sandra Park. I said, "I need you to find out everything you can about a notary named Carol Deering." She did. Carol Deering ran a document preparation and notary service from a storefront on South Grand that also offered tax preparation and passport photos. She was 59 years old, had been in business for 22 years, and according to Sandra Park, kept meticulous records. Sandra reached out to her directly. Carol Deering remembered Robert Chen. He had come in on May 8, 2021, 4 weeks after the handwritten statement in the desk drawer, approximately 3 months before his death. He had come alone. He had brought a document that he had prepared himself. The document was a formal amendment to his estate, not a full will revision, which would have required an attorney, but a codicil, a supplemental document that added specific directions to an existing will. It directed, in plain language, that the property at Carlisle Lake, with deed number and property description included, my father being an engineer, should pass directly to Maya Chen and Daniel Chen in equal shares at the time of his death, superseding any other provision regarding that property. Carol Deering had witnessed his signature. She had notarized the document. She had made a copy for her records, as she did with all notarized documents. She had the copy. She was willing to provide it. I am going to be honest with you. I did not find this out calmly. Sandra called me at my desk at work on a Tuesday morning and told me what Carol Deering had found in her records. I excused myself from my desk and went to the bathroom and stood at the sink for approximately 2 minutes doing the particular breathing that you do when something that has been held at an enormous tension finally releases. My father had done it. He had gone to a notary. 3 months before he died, with a disease that was taking everything from him 1 degree at a time, he had driven himself to a storefront on South Grand and had had his intentions witnessed and recorded. He had not been able to count on the attorney whose name he had written in the statement, whether Margaret Voss was a real person who had let him down, or a false name Patricia had introduced, or something else I still don't entirely understand. But he had found another way. He had always found another way. He was a mechanical engineer. He solved problems. He had solved this one. He had just needed someone to find the solution he'd left. Sandra filed a formal challenge to the will in St. Louis County Probate Court the following week, citing the codicil, the handwriting statement, Aunt Helen's testimony, and a formal request for inquiry into the circumstances under which the October 2020 will had been executed. Specifically, who had been present, who had prepared it, and whether my father had had independent counsel review it. Patricia's attorney, she had retained one quickly, a probate specialist named Mark Bellows, filed a response arguing that the codicil was improperly executed. It lacked an attorney's signature, though Missouri law has specific provisions for notarized codicils, that my father's mental capacity in his final months was diminished, and that the will represented his clear and considered wishes. The claim of diminished capacity made my Aunt Helen, who had visited my father in July 2021, the month before he died, and had a very clear and specific conversation with him about his wishes, incandescent. She gave a sworn statement. Her memory was excellent, her testimony was detailed, and she had, it turned out, something I had not known she had. A voicemail. My father had called her on July 15, 2021. She had not answered, she had been in the garden, and he had left a message. She had not deleted it. He said, "Helen, it's Robert. I want to tell you something while I can say it clearly. The lake house is for the kids, Maya and Daniel. I've put it in writing twice, and I want you to know in case anything happens. It's for them, that's what I want." That was his voice, 3 weeks before he died, clear, direct, and specific. The voicemail, once it was submitted as evidence, changed the shape of the case entirely. Patricia's attorney withdrew the diminished capacity argument within 2 weeks. James Whitfield had owned the property adjacent to my father's lake cabin since 2001. He was 71, retired from a career in insurance, a widower who spent most of May through September at the lake and wintered in Florida. He and my father had been neighbors in the particular way of lake neighbors, not intimate, but consistent, the daily small courtesies of people who share a shoreline. He had seen my father every summer for 20 years. He had fished with him occasionally. He had been the person my father called when the dock needed an extra pair of hands for a repair. Sandra had identified him as a potential witness. I called him in September 2021. He answered on the first ring. He said, I wondered when someone would call. He had been at the lake for the full summer of 2021, which meant he had been there when Patricia and Kevin had visited, in June, for a long weekend without my father, while my father was undergoing treatment in St. Louis. He described what he had observed. Patricia and Kevin had arrived on a Friday evening. They had been at the cabin for 2 days. On the second day, a third person had arrived, a man James didn't know, who Kevin had introduced as a colleague helping with some paperwork. They had been inside the cabin for approximately 2 hours. Kevin's colleague had been carrying a laptop bag. James had not thought much of it at the time. People had colleagues. People did paperwork. He had thought much more of it later, when he had read, in a conversation with my father in August, one of the last my father had managed to have in person, that my father had not known about the June visit at all. Patricia had told him she was visiting a friend in Springfield. Kevin had not mentioned the lake. My father had looked, James said, like a man who was processing something quietly. He had said very little. Then he had said, "Did they go inside?" James said, "Yes, with another man." My father had nodded. He had gone back to looking at the water. James said, "I thought he might be upset. He just looked tired." He said, "He called me once after that. Left a message saying he was working on something and that he hoped I'd keep an eye on the place after he was gone. I thought he just meant the general neighborly thing. I kept the message." He had the message. He gave Sandra consent to have it transcribed. My father, in his own voice at the end of his life, "James, it's Robert. I'm asking you to keep an eye on things after I go. The kids should have the lake. I've done what I can to make sure of it. Just keep an eye on things." 2 phone messages. One to Aunt Helen, one to James Whitfield. My father had known that the people who would carry his message forward were the ones who had nothing to gain from it. He had chosen his witnesses carefully, the way he did everything. James Whitfield gave a full deposition in November 2021. He was, as Aunt Helen had been, precise and unimpressed by the proceedings. He answered what he was asked and offered nothing extra. When Bellows suggested that he might be misremembering the details of the June visit, who had been there, what they had done, he said, with a patience that had the faint undertone of offense, "I have lived alone for 7 years, counselor. I observe carefully. It is how I spend my time." The deposition was 4 hours long. Every hour of it was useful. In the weeks following the deposition, Sandra filed a supplemental motion requesting documentary evidence of the June 2021 visit. Any records of Kevin's travel, any records of a third party attending, and separately requested information about the attorney or service that had prepared the October 2020 will. What she found there was the thing that moved the case from a difficult fight to a clearer one. The October 2020 will had been prepared by Gerald Marsh, the same attorney who had read it to us in his Clayton office. But the signature on the will had been witnessed by 2 people. One was a paralegal from Marsh's office, which was conventional. The second was Kevin Holt. Kevin Holt had witnessed his stepfather's will, a will that left his mother a significant property, a witness who stood to benefit, indirectly but materially, from the document he was witnessing. In Missouri, a beneficiary, or the close relative of a beneficiary, witnessing a will creates a specific legal issue. Patricia was the direct beneficiary. Kevin was her son. The line between close relative of a beneficiary and Kevin Holt was not a difficult one to draw. Sandra said on the phone, "This may void the will entirely, regardless of the codicil." I said, "May void." She said, "Will, in my opinion." She was right. I want to stop again here and give you the version of my father that exists outside the legal proceedings, because he was more than a case and more than a victim, and I do not want the story to reduce him to either. In July 2021, 3 weeks before he died, I went to Carlisle Lake alone. My father was not there, he was not well enough for the drive, but I went because I needed to. I let myself in with the key he had given me in 1994, which I had carried ever since. The cabin was unchanged. That was the remarkable thing. 27 years after he bought it, it was still the same small two-bedroom cabin, the same furniture, the same smell of lake water and pine and cedar closet. The fishing gear was in the same corner. The photograph of Daniel and his first bass was on the same wall. I sat on the dock for most of the afternoon. The lake was doing its summer thing, boat traffic in the distance, a hot wind off the water, the particular blue of an Illinois lake in July. I did not fish. I just sat. I thought about my grandfather, who had taken my father to this lake when my father was young, who had known where the fish were, who had died before I was born. I thought about the chain of that, the man who brought my father here, the father who brought me here, the 20 years of July that had been given to Daniel and me like a gift that was also a lesson about what it means to pass something down. I thought about Patricia and Kevin in the cabin in June without telling my father, about the man with the laptop bag, about what had been done in those 2 hours while my father was in St. Louis receiving treatment. I thought he saved for 11 years for this. He packed his lunch. He drove the same car for 14 years. Then I went inside and I sat at his desk. The desk he had brought from the city, that sat in the corner of the second bedroom he used as a study. And I opened the bottom drawer and I looked at the fishing lure catalogs and I thought about the envelope underneath them and what it had contained. He had been so careful, so specific, and engineered to the last. I closed the drawer. I made coffee in his kitchen using his coffee maker and the ground coffee he kept in the freezer the way he always had. I drank it on the dock as the sun went down. The lake at evening is a different thing than the lake in the afternoon. The traffic is gone. The water goes still and glassy. On the east shore, where the cabin is, the light goes gold and then amber and then gray, and the fireflies start in the reeds, and it is exactly as quiet as it should be. I sat there until it was dark. I did not have my phone out. I was just there, in the place that my father had made for us, doing the thing he had taught me, being present in a specific place, paying it the attention it deserved. I drove back to Chicago the next morning. I called Daniel. I said, I went to the lake. He said, how was it? I said it was his. It was completely his. He said, yeah. I said, we're going to get it back. He said, I know. 3 weeks later, my father died. He died in the early morning in the St. Louis house, in the bedroom that had been arranged by Patricia with her furniture and her choices. Daniel and I were there. Aunt Helen was there. Patricia was there. He did not say anything at the end. He was past saying things. But I sat next to him, and I held his hand, and I thought about the fireflies in the reeds, and the coffee on the dock, and the July mornings when the fog burned off the water. He had taught me, by example, what it meant to love a place with your whole heart. I intended to honor that. Sandra filed the formal contestation of the will in St. Louis County Probate Court on October 4, 2021, 7 weeks after my father's death. The grounds were as follows. First, the codicil executed May 8, 2021, properly notarized, meeting Missouri's requirements for a notarized codicil, which specifically directed the lake property to Daniel and me. Second, the witnessing irregularity. Kevin Holt, son of the primary beneficiary, had served as an attesting witness to a will that indirectly benefited him. Third, the documented evidence of my father's stated intentions. The handwritten statement, the voicemail to Aunt Helen, the message to James Whitfield, which established a consistent and unambiguous expression of intent that directly contradicted the will's provision regarding the lake property. The fourth ground was one Sandra had added based on something I had brought to her, a pattern of behavior in the months before the will's execution that warranted scrutiny. Patricia's management of my father's affairs, including his contact with legal professionals, his schedule, and his access to independent counsel, had been such that she was, at minimum, the primary gatekeeper for every significant decision he made in the year before the October 2020 will. Whether that rose to the level of undue influence was a question for the court. Sandra thought it did. Bellows' response was swift and aggressive. He challenged the validity of the codicil. He challenged Aunt Helen's interpretation of the voicemail. He challenged James Whitfield's recollection of the June visit. What he could not easily challenge was Kevin Holt's signature on the will. The witnessing irregularity was a clean legal issue. Missouri statute is specific about beneficiary relatives witnessing wills. Kevin Holt's status as Patricia's son, and therefore indirect beneficiary, was a matter of record, not interpretation. Sandra argued that this irregularity, under Missouri law, was sufficient to void the will in its entirety, or, at minimum, to void the provision relating to the lake property, which was the one that Kevin's witness signature most directly benefited. In January 2022, 4 months after filing, Probate Court Judge Thomas Avery ruled that the witnessing irregularity was material and that the provision regarding the Carlisle Lake property was void on that basis. He further found, in a supplemental ruling 2 weeks later, that the notarized codicil of May 8, 2021 was valid under Missouri law and represented Robert Chen's expressed intention regarding the lake property at the time closest to his death. The lake property passed to Daniel Chen and Maya Chen in equal shares. Patricia appealed. The appeal took 8 months. It was denied in October 2022, 14 months after my father's death. The cabin on the east shore of Carlisle Lake is ours. I want to fill in the human texture of those 14 months, because the legal milestones were the scaffolding, but the actual structure was built from smaller things. Daniel came to Chicago for a weekend in November 2021, 6 weeks after the filing. We ate takeout in my apartment and spread the whole file across my kitchen table. We had both, at various points in those first weeks, felt the particular exhaustion of grief compounded by conflict. The way it is worse when you cannot simply mourn, because there is also something to fight, and the fighting takes everything the grief has left. We talked, that weekend, about our father in ways we had not talked about him since the funeral. Daniel told me about a fishing trip in July of 1998 that I had not been on, just him and our father, just the two of them, the summer I had gone to a camp in Michigan and had not made it to Carlisle. He said, "It was the best summer of my childhood. I've never told you that because I was afraid it would seem like I was claiming something." I said, "You're allowed to claim things." He said, "The voicemail." I knew what he meant, the voicemail to Aunt Helen, our father's voice saying the lake house is for the kids, Maya and Daniel, 3 weeks before he died. Daniel said, "He was so clear." I said, "He was always clear, that was him." Daniel said, "I want to fix the dock." I said, "What?" He said the dock had some boards that needed replacing. He'd been meaning to do it. I want to fix it. I said, "I'll help." He said, "You don't know anything about docks." I said, "I helped plant a rose. I can figure out a dock." That was November. We fixed the dock the following May. The months between were not easy. Patricia's appeal required response. Bellows was not a gracious loser. His filings in the appeal period were aggressive and occasionally personal, implying that Daniel and I had exploited our father's diminished capacity in his final months to extract commitments from him. Sandra was steady. I was steady, mostly. Daniel had 2 weeks in January where he was not steady, and I called him every day those 2 weeks without making it a thing, just called and talked until he was steadier. The practical matters were complicated. The lake property was in a legal limbo during the appeal. Neither party could do anything with it, which meant maintenance was uncertain. James Whitfield, bless him, kept an eye on things the way my father had asked. He replaced a section of roof flashing that was letting in water. He sent me a photograph of it with the dimensions and a description of what he'd done. He was very precise. He would have gotten along well with my father. In June 2022, while the appeal was still pending, Daniel and I went to the lake for the first time since my father's death. We could not legally make changes to the property, but we could visit. Patricia had not been there was nothing for her there legally, and she had not pushed. We let ourselves in with the key. The cabin was dusty but intact. The photograph of Daniel and his first bass was on the wall. My father's coffee maker was on the counter. His fishing gear was in the corner. We opened the windows, we swept out the winter dust, we made coffee. We sat on the dock, James's repaired dock, and we drank it in the morning with the fog on the water. It was exactly as it had always been. We did not talk about the case. We talked about our father. We talked about the 2 summers with his father, the grandfather we had never met, the man who knew where the fish were. Daniel said, "Do you think he's here somewhere?" He meant both of them, the grandfather and the father. I said, "I think this is where he left what was most himself." Daniel said, "Yeah." We fished for 2 hours. Neither of us caught anything. My father would have found this deeply unsurprising and would have had specific, technical suggestions for improvement. We laughed about that. It was the first time I had laughed in a while. The deposition of Patricia Chen took place in St. Louis in August 2022, 2 months before the appeal ruling. Sandra deposed her. I was not present. Sandra gave me the account afterward with her characteristic precision. Patricia was composed, professionally warm, and extremely careful with her language. She maintained that the will represented Robert's genuine wishes, that she had not influenced its preparation, and that the codicil, which she characterized as something my father had done in a period of confusion and fear, did not reflect his true intentions. She was asked about the June 2021 visit to the lake cabin. She said, "I went to check on things while Robert was receiving treatment." Sandra asked, "Did Robert ask you to go?" She said, "He knew I was going." Sandra asked, "Did he ask you to go?" A pause. She said, "I informed him I was going." Sandra asked, "Who was the third party who accompanied Kevin?" She said, "A colleague of Kevin's. He was visiting the area." Sandra asked, "What was the nature of their business at the cabin?" She said, "They were just visiting." Sandra asked, "Why would Kevin's colleague visit a cabin he had never been to?" She said, "Kevin wanted to show him the lake." Sandra asked, "Did they access any of the interior of the cabin?" She said, "Briefly." Sandra asked, "What did they do inside?" She said, "I don't recall specifically." She said this about several things. "I don't recall specifically. I don't remember the exact details. I believe that was the case, but I couldn't be certain." Sandra said to me afterward, "The specificity of her uncertainty was itself informative." Kevin was not deposed. He was not a party to the case, but his name appeared throughout the documentary record in ways that Bellows struggled to explain away. The deposition of Gerald Marsh was more illuminating. He had prepared the October 2020 will. He had done so, he testified, based on instructions provided by Robert Chen in a meeting in September 2020. He had met with Robert twice. At both meetings, Patricia had been present. Sandra asked, "Was Robert accompanied by independent counsel at either meeting?" Marsh said no. Sandra asked, "At any point, did you suggest to Robert that he might wish to consult with independent counsel before executing a significant estate document?" Marsh said, "That is standard advice I provide." Sandra asked, "Did you provide it?" A pause. Marsh said, "I believe so." Sandra asked, "Do you have documentation of having provided it?" Marsh said, "It would be in the meeting notes." The meeting notes, when produced, did not contain it. There was no documentation that Gerald Marsh had ever suggested to my father, in any of their meetings, that he might benefit from independent counsel in reviewing his estate plan. Every meeting had included Patricia. Not one had included anyone whose interest aligned with my father's rather than with Patricia's. This was what my father had tried to navigate around, with his handwritten statement and his visit to Carol Deering and his phone calls to Helen and James. He had tried to work around the system of people who were managing his access to his own affairs. He had succeeded, just barely, by leaving traces that were just scattered enough that no one had thought to eliminate all of them. My father was meticulous, and in the end, his meticulousness was what protected us. The appeal was denied on October 17, 2022. The ruling from the Missouri Court of Appeals affirmed the probate court's decision on both grounds. The witnessing irregularity was material, and the notarized codicil was valid and controlling with respect to the Carlisle Lake property. The property passed to Daniel and me. I heard the news on a Tuesday afternoon at my desk in Chicago via a call from Sandra, who spoke in the same measured tone she used for everything. She said, "The appeal has been denied. The cabin is yours and Daniel's." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Your father did the work. We just found it." That is the truest thing anyone said about this case. I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. I told him. He said, "Good." Then he was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'm going to fix that dock properly this spring. Not just the boards, the whole structure." I said, "Yes." He said he would have wanted it to last. I said, "Yes." We were quiet together for a moment. The particular quiet of two people who have been through the same thing at a remove and have arrived at the same place. Daniel said, "Do you think Patricia knew about the codicil?" I said, "I think she suspected. The June visit, Kevin and the colleague, the laptop bag, I think they were trying to find something. I think they were hoping my father hadn't done anything they couldn't undo." Daniel said, "But he had." I said, "But he had." He said, "Good for him." And then we talked about the dock. Patricia did not contest further. The transfer of title was completed in December 2022, approximately 16 months after my father's death. Kevin and Brenda played no further role in any proceedings. Whatever their knowledge of or participation in the June 2021 visit, the legal avenue for pursuing it had closed with the appeal ruling. I have not spoken to Patricia since the probate proceedings. I do not know what she thought she was doing, whether she genuinely believed the lake house was something my father had wanted to give her, or whether she had understood from the beginning that she was working against his wishes. I have thought about this question, and I cannot answer it. I do not think it would help me to be able to. What I know is what my father left me, and it is not only the cabin. He left me the understanding that being specific about what you want, writing it down, having it witnessed, leaving it in more than one place, trusting more than one person, is an act of love. It is the thing you do for the people who come after you, the thing that says, "I wanted to be sure you knew." He was sure. He made sure we would know. The first summer we spent at Carlisle as its owners was the summer of 2023. We went in July, as we always had, as our father always had. Daniel brought his family, his partner of 6 years, Claire, and their 2 children, ages 7 and 4. The 4-year-old, a girl named Emma, had never been to the lake. She stood at the end of the dock on the first morning and looked at the water with the focused intensity of a small person encountering something larger than herself. Daniel said, "You know, Grandpa Robert used to come here every summer." Emma said, "Where is he?" Daniel said, "He's not here anymore, but this was his favorite place. He wanted us to have it." Emma said, "Why?" Daniel said, "Because he wanted us to love it like he did." Emma considered this. Then she said, "I'm going to love it." She did. She fell in twice off the dock in the first 3 days, which my father would have found both alarming and hilarious. And she caught a small bluegill on the afternoon of the 4th day that she held in both hands, and examined with a scientific seriousness before returning it to the water. Daniel and I sat on the dock that first evening and watched the sun go down over the west shore. We drank our father's specific brand of coffee, which we had tracked down and bought for the occasion. We did not talk much. At one point, Daniel said, "Do you hear the fireflies?" I said, "You can't hear fireflies." He said, "I know, I just like saying it." That was the thing. Being there without grief at the center of it, being there just to be there, the way our father had been there. The lake doing its lake thing, the evening calm, the amber light, the boat traffic gone. James Whitfield on his dock 2 properties down, waving when he saw us. James came over for coffee the next morning. He and Daniel talked about the dock renovation Daniel had done in the spring, the full structural replacement he had promised on the phone in October 2022. James approved. He had suggestions for next steps. He and Daniel, it turned out, shared a specific technical interest in the mechanics of lake dock construction that is both more interesting than it sounds and deeply appropriate for this story. Claire took the children fishing in the afternoon, while Daniel and James continued their conversation. I sat in my father's chair, the old canvas chair he had brought from the city that had been on the dock for 20 years, and I read and drank coffee and watched the lake. This is what I had fought for, not the property in the abstract. This, the right to sit in this chair, in this place, and be exactly where I was supposed to be. My father had given us that. Twice, actually. Once when he bought the cabin, and again when he went to a notary on South Grand and made sure we would keep it. There's a photograph on my phone from July 2023 that I want to describe to you. Daniel is standing at the end of the dock, the new dock he built, solid and right, the way our father would have built it. He is holding Emma on his shoulders, which puts her high enough to see over the reeds and across the whole width of the lake. She has her arms out for balance. The water behind them is the specific blue of Carlisle Lake in July afternoon. The photograph is not composed. I took it quickly on my phone without thinking about framing. It is a little tilted. The light is not perfect. But in it, Daniel's face is completely open, without the careful expression he wears at work, without the protective layer that the past 2 years of fighting had put on both of us. He is just a man with his daughter on his shoulders, at the lake where his father took him, looking at the water. I have that photograph as my phone background. I look at it every day. The dock is the thing that connects everything in this story. My grandfather's 2 summers with my father's 20 years of July with Daniel and me, Emma with her arms out over the water. The dock is where you go when you want to be at the edge of the thing, close to the water, close to what the lake actually is rather than the idea of it. My father stood on that dock at the end of a July evening when I was 12 years old and said, "You know what I like about this place?" I said, "The fish." He said, "The fish is part of it. But I like that out there, the water doesn't know who I am. It's the same for everyone. A lake doesn't give preferences." I said, "That's a weird thing to like." He said, "Maybe, I like it anyway." I think about that now. The water doesn't know who I am. The lake doesn't give preferences. Whatever Patricia and Kevin had planned for this place, the lake had not cooperated. It had remained exactly what it was, doing its thing, the fog in the morning, the fireflies in the reeds, the July light going gold and amber and gray, waiting for whoever was supposed to be there. We were supposed to be there. We are there now. My father knew. He made sure we would be. If you are still here, thank you, I mean that. I want to say something practical before we go, because I think it is important. If your parent is aging, if they have property, if there is someone new in their life, have the document conversation. Not the emotional one. The document one. Where are the originals? Who has copies? Has a notary been involved? Is there an attorney who represents their interests specifically, not someone who was recommended by a new spouse or a stepchild? My father had the instinct. He went to Carol Deering, he called Aunt Helen, he called James Whitfield, he left the envelope in the drawer. He did everything he could in the time he had. Not everyone knows to do that. Tell the people you love, leave a record, leave more than one, trust more than one person with it. A lake doesn't give preferences, but a deed does. Make sure it says what you mean. Subscribe if you want to stay. There are more stories here. Leave yours in the comments if you have one. Thank you for listening to my father's story.